The video game industry has continued to grow in the past 30 years. Home consoles are more popular than ever, but what about their smaller siblings? Remember the days when we had entire console wars between handheld devices? Back when you could go into a game store and see entire sections devoted to handhelds. And of course, who can forget the overabundance of accessories? But somewhere along the line, that all changed. These days, the portable gaming industry seems dominated by mobile devices, and the closest thing we have to dedicated handheld consoles are the Switch and the Steam Deck, and they're both sort of hybrids anyway. So, have handhelds peaked? Have we moved past the handheld console as a specific entity? Well, to answer that question, let's start by taking a look at the history of handhelds to see how we ended up here. We start in the 1970s with the predecessor of the handheld games console, the handheld electronic games. These were typically built around a very simple, single pre-programmed game. Early examples of this include Nintendo's Game & Watch series and the various Tiger Electronics games. The first example of what we can define as a handheld games console, a portable device that can play interchangeable games, was the Microvision released in 1979. It was notable for being the first device with removable game cartridges. Well, they weren't really cartridges. The games actually made up half the device, including the faceplate and the game-specific buttons. Without the faceplate, the poor Microvision looks like C-3PO from Episode 1. The Microvision was, unfortunately, a commercial failure, something that would end up being a recurring trend in the industry in the years to come. The rest of the 80s saw a few other companies attempt to release a handheld console, but none of them took off until Nintendo decided to enter the market. The Japanese publisher had earlier success with its Game & Watch handhelds, but their pre-printed overlay screens limited them to a single game. Instead, Nintendo wanted to adapt their home console experience to handhelds.
Go with the power of the NES, right in the palm of your hand. Game Boy, the state-of-the-art compact video game system for portable handheld video action.
Compared with its experimental predecessors, Nintendo went with a refined, almost utilitarian approach. The simple control scheme of 4 buttons and D-pad, paired with an 8-bit dot matrix screen, a good battery life, and an affordable price, created the standard for future handhelds to come. By the end of its life cycle, the Game Boy family would sell over 118 million units, and boast a library of over 1,200 games. 1989 also saw the release of the Atari Lynx. Now, on paper, this thing would have dominated Nintendo's grey brick. Not only did it have better graphics, it also had a color screen which was backlit. Unfortunately, the Lynx cost twice as much as the Game Boy, had much worse battery life, and was also huge. Plus, the Lynx's game library was nowhere near as strong as the Game Boy's. And this would establish a pattern for the rest of the 90s. A competitor would release a handheld with better specs and features than the Game Boy, only to underperform and eventually get discontinued due to Nintendo's bulletproof triforce of price, battery, and games library. For example, we've got the Turbo Express, a handheld version of the TurboGrafx 16, very advanced for the time. It sold 1.5 million before being discontinued. Or how about the Game.com from Tiger Electronics, the first handheld with a touchscreen and internet connection. It sold 300,000 before being discontinued. Then there was Bandai's WonderSwan, created by Game Boy creator himself Gunpei Yokoi. It sold 3.5 million before being discontinued. The only 90s handheld which came remotely close to the Game Boy was Sega's Game Gear, which sold 11 million. The Game Gear had a colored backlit screen, but sadly also suffered from a short battery life. Also, a shout out to the Sega Nomad, which could literally play Mega Drive games and connect to the television, something that Nintendo wouldn't do for another 2 decades with the Switch. Unfortunately, you guessed it, it sold 1 million before being discontinued. Looking at this, you could make a pretty good argument that Game Boy's dominance over the market actually stifled innovation and prevented handhelds from peaking in the 90s. Yes, Nintendo would eventually release more compact version of the console, such as the Game Boy Pocket and Lite, but but the architecture was still identical. Even the Game Boy Color released in '98 was more of a slight hardware revision than a true next-generation successor. I guess the unexpected global success of the Pokemon games in the late '90s also played a part in prolonging the life cycle of the aging Game Boy platform. In 2001, Nintendo would finally release the Game Boy Advance, with 32-bit graphics, a wider display, and finally a pair of goddamn shoulder buttons. Nintendo had brought their handheld into the new millennium. Well, kind of. Look, I love the GBA, I really do, but it's clear that Nintendo was still playing it safe in order to keep the Triforce of success alive. And it worked. The Game Boy Advance family of consoles went on to sell 80 million units, and boasted a library of 1,500 titles, even if a big chunk of them were just Super Nintendo ports with 2 buttons missing. And let's be honest, the few competitors Nintendo had in those years didn't exactly do much to move the needle. Remember Nokia's N-Gage? Who would want to play games on their phone, right? In the early 2000s, handhelds were far from reaching their peak. By this time, consumers had grown to expect that portables would be about a decade behind in graphics compared to their home console counterparts. Yes, Nintendo would further modernize the Game Boy Advance 2 years later by introducing the SP line, which finally had a backlight and rechargeable built-in batteries. But it still played the same 16-bit looking games. Growing up back then, the dream was to one day play console-level games on handheld hardware. And that's when Sony entered the picture. Having taken Nintendo's place as the king of the home consoles, Sony also looked to kick it off the handheld throne. In the late 90s, they had tested the waters in Japan with the tiny Pocket Station, but in late 2004, Sony entered the market properly with the PlayStation Portable. And at the time, this thing really felt like the future. It had a contemporary control scheme, played music, movies went online, had Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, USB, a huge display, and most importantly, it played home console level games. Almost. If you squinted, the PSP version of Battlefront looked about the same as the PS2. This was what we had dreamt of, playing Pokemon Gold on our Game Boy Colors with no backlit screen only a few years earlier. I remember there were so many people around at the time who predicted the end for Nintendo. Of course, Nintendo weren't going to just roll over, but they had learned their lesson on the home console front. Seeing both Nintendo 64 and GameCube underperform against Sony's consoles made them realize they shouldn't be taking the competition head on. And so the company decided to take on a different approach with the Nintendo DS. Yes, the system was more powerful than the GBA, finally being able to play 3D games properly, but it was still about a generation behind the PSP when it came to graphics. Instead, Nintendo focused on switching up the gameplay style by having 2 screens and touch controls. But in true Nintendo style, they were still playing it safe with the DS. Yes, it was underpowered, but it was $50 cheaper than the PSP at launch. And yes, Nintendo touted the dual screens and touch controls as big selling points, but they still left the door very much open for classic handheld style games with the GBA port in the back and a set of physical controls lifted straight from the Super Nintendo. And so the battle lines were drawn, Sony trying to beat Nintendo at their own game with a supercharged Game Boy, and Nintendo trying to one-up Sony by changing up their own formula. At first, the competition between the two consoles was pretty close, but just like in the generations prior, Nintendo's incredibly strong games catalog and third-party support meant that the DS began to pull away. Now, the PlayStation Portable still ended up being the most successful non-Nintendo handheld ever made, selling as much as the Game Boy Advance, but the DS would just end up going into the stratosphere. Just like with the Wii, Nintendo had successfully marketed it to a huge consumer base. Everyone and their grandmother literally had a Nintendo DS, which meant that by the end of its life cycle, it outsold the Game Boy, coming in just behind the PlayStation 2 as the second best-selling console ever. Both Sony and Nintendo would continue the battle into the following generation with the 3DS and the PS Vita. Nintendo continued trying to introduce new gameplay experiences with the 3D gimmick,
which was the style at the time.
While Sony took another step towards bridging the gap between home consoles and handhelds with Vita's high-end features and hardware. And all these years later, the console still has a dedicated cult following, and to some, the Vita was the peak of handheld hardware. Unfortunately, just like many before it, Sony's console was plagued by poor third-party support, especially in the West, and would end up selling a fraction of its rivals' numbers. But even the 3DS, while still a success for Nintendo, only ended up selling half the units of its predecessor. And this was partially due to the changing nature of the handheld landscape. Remember the N-Gage and how nobody would want to play games on their phone? Well, now they did. By the 2010s, smartphones had morphed into these ubiquitous devices that can now be used for all your entertainment needs, including video games. Now, mobile gaming is a whole other topic that deserves its own video, so I won't dive too much into it, but what's undeniable is that from about 2010 onwards, a large portion of the handheld gaming market would end up migrating to smartphones and tablet devices. So where does that leave the dedicated handheld games console? Well, Sony discontinued the Vita in 2019, bowing out of the handheld market altogether. As for Nintendo, after a bunch of 3DS revisions and variants, the Japanese giant shifted its focus to the Switch, the first major hybrid home and handheld console. In 2019, Nintendo stopped production of the 3DS and did something really interesting. Instead of introducing a successor, they replaced it with the Switch Lite, a handheld-only version of the big hybrid console. In 2022, Valve would go on to introduce the Steam Deck, which took a similar hybrid approach that the Switch did for home consoles, only this time for Steam-based PC games. The device is still really early in its life cycle, but it has received a lot of praise and positive feedback. The Steam Deck's success has ushered other manufacturers to bring pocket gaming PCs onto the market. The last couple of years have also seen a rise in retro handhelds, and just like my channel, these devices are designed to tug at the nostalgia strings inside millennials with their retro-inspired designs and focus on emulating classic games. And so, broadly speaking, these are the three pillars that make up modern handheld gaming, which brings us back to the original question, have handhelds peaked? Well, I think traditional handhelds as we knew them for the past 3 decades did peak with the likes of the PS Vita. I don't think we'll ever have a dedicated piece of hardware with its own games library again. Instead, it seems like handheld consoles going forward will follow a hybrid approach and share games libraries with their home console or PC counterparts, only with slight graphical downgrades. The Switch Lite selling 18 million units and the Steam Deck's growing following shows us that handheld gaming is still very much around, and while traditional handheld hardware may have peaked, portable gaming itself continues to evolve. But that's just my take. Please leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think handhelds have peaked? Which is your favorite handheld device of all time, and where do you see them going in the future? As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a big thanks to all of my existing patrons. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.